we firstly continue with our working through the first book of Samuel. You'll find the reading on page 272 if you wish to follow, and I shall be starting at verse 12 of 1 Samuel chapter 2. Eli's sons were wicked men. They had no regard for the Lord. Now it was the practice of the priests with the people that whenever anyone offered a sacrifice, and while the meat was being boiled, the servant of the priest would come with a three-pronged fork in his hand. He would plunge it into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot, and the priest would take for himself whatever the fork brought up. This is how they treated all the Israelites who came to Shiloh. But even before the fat was burned, the servant of the priest would come and say to the man who was sacrificing, "Give the priest some meat to roast. He won't accept boiled meat from you, but only raw." If the man said to him, "Let the fat be burned up first, and then take whatever you want," the servant would then answer, "No, hand it over now. If you don't, I'll take it by force." This sin of the young men was very great in the Lord's sight, for they were treating the Lord's offering with contempt. But Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy wearing a linen ephod. Each year his mother made him a little robe and took it to him when she went up with her husband to offer the annual sacrifice. Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife, saying, "May the Lord give you children by this woman, to take the place of the one she prayed for and gave to the Lord." Then they would go home. And the Lord was gracious to Hannah. She conceived and gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters. Meanwhile, the boy Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord. Now Eli, who was very old, heard about everything his sons were doing to all Israel, and how they slept with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting. So he said to them, "Why do you do such things? I hear from all the people about these wicked deeds of yours. No, my sons, it is not a good report that I hear spreading among the Lord's people. If a man sins against another man, God may mediate for him. But if a man sins against the Lord, who will intercede for him?" His sons, however, did not listen to their father's rebuke, for it was the Lord's will to put them to death. And the boy Samuel continued to grow in stature and in favor with the Lord and with men. Now a man of God came to Eli and said to him, "This is what the Lord says. Did I not clearly reveal myself to your father's house when they were in Egypt under Pharaoh? I chose your father out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest, to go up to my altar, to burn incense, and to wear an ephod in my presence. I also gave your father's house all the offerings made with fire by the Israelites. Why do you scorn my sacrifice and offering that I prescribed for my dwelling? Why do you honor your sons more than me by fattening yourselves on the choice parts of every offering made by the people Israel? Therefore the Lord, the God of Israel, declares, I promised that your house and your father's house would minister before me forever. But now the Lord declares, far be it from me. Those who honor me I will honor, but those who despise me will be disdained. The time is coming when I will cut short your strength and the strength of your father's house, so that there will not be an old man in your family line, and you will see distress in my dwelling. Although good will be done to Israel, in your family line there will never be an old man. Every one of you that I do not cut off from my altar will be spared only to blind your eyes with tears and to grieve your heart, and all your descendants will die in the prime of life. And what happens to your 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, will be a sign to you. They will both die on the same day. I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who will do according to what is in my heart and mind. I will firmly establish his house, and he will minister before my anointed one always. Then everyone left in your family line will come and bow down before him for a piece of silver and a crust of bread and plead, 'Appoint me to some priestly office so that I can have food to eat.'"
Pick out, we've got honour and respect for God, we've got consequences of actions, and we've got integrity and humility in our lives. And hopefully through these two difficult passages and scenes, we'll hear what God is saying to our hearts and lives. So we started with 1 Samuel. We have the story here of Eli and his sons, how they have come to disobey the Lord, abuse their position of authority, and ultimately experience the consequences of their sin. We have God speaking to Eli and predicting their death and the consequences for his family line in the future, because he honoured his sons more than God. Eli warned his sons, but they continued deliberately cheating, seducing, and robbing people. Consider that situation in the story, but try and get our heads around. This is in a context 1,000 years before Jesus. It's a world and a culture that we cannot comprehend, we'd struggle to imagine, and we definitely struggle to survive in. But in this Jewish culture, a person made an offering in order to have his sins forgiven, and Eli's sons stole that offering. They made a sham of the person's repentant attitude. God could not permit this, because we have to remember Jesus hadn't come yet. He'd not made a way for them to be forgiven without sacrifice. So this sacrificial system was all they had to be right with God. It was vital and it was holy. Now I'm going to be asking you several questions, like challenges, throughout my talk, and I just want you to pick one this morning, because we're all in different places in our lives and our journeys. So just pick the one that really speaks to you. The first one. Are there times when we make a sham or mockery of someone else's attempts at holiness? The greatest sin wasn't just the obvious sin of Eli's son, that of greed and violence and intimidation, all the things that were listed. It was that these made others not to want to come and bring offerings to the Lord. It was bad enough what they did, but the greater sin was in how they hurt other people, dissuading them from worship. They were scattering the people, not gathering them. So, another challenge. That all of us should give deep reverence to spiritual matters. Do we give deep reverence to spiritual matters? Verses 12 to 16 explain that Eli's sons were stealing the best parts of the offering before the offering was given to God. Now it was right that the priests received some food from the offering, as that is how the priests were taken care of, because they couldn't farm. They couldn't take advantage of their position and wanted the best for themselves. Their contempt and arrogance towards both people and worship undermined the integrity of the whole priesthood. But this is such a simple challenge for us. Do we give God the best parts of ourselves, whether that be money or talents or time, heart or mind, or do we take the best for ourselves and give him what is left? Do we honour God with our money before we budget, or budget and give him what is left? Do we start our day with him when we have energy, only remember God at the end of the day and fall asleep in prayer? Do we give God our best? We read that Eli tried reprimanding his sons, but this wasn't enough because they never saw any action or consequences of their sin. Because Eli didn't bring consequences, so they just continued. Eli was in charge of the tabernacle. It was his job to stop any abuse there, but it would seem because they were his sons, he let it continue. As a high priest, Eli should have cast them out of the community and cut them off. As it was said in the law, in the book of Numbers, that is what should have happened. However, he ignored the situation, and those selfish actions of his son ruined their lives and the lives of their community. It gives us another challenge. Are there any family situations for us that we know are wrong, but we're just ignoring them because it's easier to live with that comfort above the truth because the consequences are too great? Eli is implicated in their behaviour, for he's not restrained his sons, but rather he honours his sons above God. In verse 30 it says, "Those who honour God, I will honour." On a side note, perhaps some of you remember that well-known film Chariots of Fire, where the Christian runner Eric Liddell refused to run a heat on Sunday. His certain faith was on display and he took flak for it. But during that film, he was handed a note that read 1 Samuel 2:30, "Those who honour me, I will honour." The race that he ran the next day rewarded his public honouring of God. Not only did he win, but he set a world record, unbeaten for 12 years. Back to the passage. The sons have dishonoured God and his worship, their office and the people. They have abused their position and power, serving themselves and mistreating the people of God. God's judgment will be harsh. Both will die on the same day. The priesthood will be removed from Eli and given to as an unnamed faithful priest yet to be mentioned. Here we learn that God refuses to cohabit with such sin and will hold his ministers to account. Leadership implications for ministers today are the same. God calls us to faithfulness, to honour God above all else, to seek holiness and be true, faithful witnesses of Jesus Christ. Let's just now turn to the second reading we had from the book of Ezekiel. This passage comes towards the end of the book. Israel was in exile, and by this time in the story, Ezekiel had predicted the fall of Jerusalem, which had just occurred in the chapter before our reading. In our passage, we have a list of sins being committed, and they reflect the sins of Eli's sons. However, God never leaves it there. The verses of hope arrive in verse 11 onwards, where it says, "For this is what the sovereign Lord says, I will search for my sheep and look after them. I will search for the lost and bring them back. I will bind up the injured and strengthen the weak, but the sleek and the strong I will destroy. I will shepherd the flock with justice." In the second half of the chapter, Ezekiel consoles the people by telling them that one day God will restore those who return from sin. God will be their king and shepherd. He will give his people a new heart to worship and establish a new government and a new temple. Chapter 34 is all about a new life, the new beginning that God was showing Ezekiel. It's full of messages of hope, messages of God restoring his people and restoring worship. This is also a prophecy about Jesus, that God would raise up a new David, a new messianic king, one that would transform his people, but not necessarily their situation, but transform them by giving them new hearts. This is what Jesus came to do and has done through the cross. He has made a way for us to have our hearts transformed, healed and restored when we say yes to him and invite him in, when we acknowledge that he has won the victory over sin in our lives through his death and resurrection. Through our celebration of Easter, we have come to know that Jesus as the servant king, which highlights the paradoxical nature of his leadership. Despite holding the high authority as the Son of God, Jesus constantly modelled servanthood throughout his life. He taught his followers to lead by serving others, exemplifying humility and selflessness. And these lessons are not just for leaders, but all who follow Jesus. Mark 10 says, where Jesus states, "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." Jesus' ultimate act of service was his sacrificial death on the cross, where he willingly gave his life to redeem humanity. As followers of Jesus, we're called to emulate this example of servant leadership. This means prioritizing the needs of others, serving the marginalized, and humbly using our gifts and resources to uplift our communities. In essence, the concept of servant king underscores the idea that true leadership is rooted in selfless service and compassion. God's message through Ezekiel uses the example of a shepherd, and this simple analogy is repeated throughout the Bible. And one of the most famous references is Psalm 23. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Jesus also refers to himself as a shepherd and described the crowds as the sheep without a shepherd. He is said in John 10, I am the good shepherd, and the good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. He wasn't an ordinary one, he was a good one, denoting a perfect one. Ezekiel condemned the shepherd leaders who led the community astray, but gave hope that one day God's perfect shepherd, the Messiah, will lead his people. And this day has come for us. Jesus is our shepherd. Thank God we are not in control, he is. And he calls all Christian leaders or followers to be attentive to his guidance and direction, discernment of the Spirit and the Scriptures in all that we say and do. So looking back to that passage, in view of such a terrible situation, what does Ezekiel say the Lord will do? He will do two things. Firstly, he will call his shepherds to account. They pastured themselves and not their sheep. So the sheep will be separated from them. They will no longer be shepherds and no longer be in position to exploit the sheep for their own benefit. Secondly, God says he will become their shepherd himself. I'm going to look after my flock myself and keep all of it in view. Ezekiel outlines the leaders' sins just like the reading from 1 Samuel and pronounces judgment upon them just like God did for Eli and his family. However, both passages go further to give us hope, the promise of a true shepherd, the Messiah. This passage gives the fate of the present shepherds, the work of the new shepherd, and the future sheep. 1 Samuel 2:35, God said, "Then I will raise up for myself a faithful priest." Who is the faithful priest predicted here? Well, this promise was partially fulfilled in Samuel because he functioned as the godly priest, effectively replacing the ungodly sons of Eli. The promise was partially filled in Zadok in the days of Solomon because he replaced Eli's family line in the priesthood. And the promise was ultimately fulfilled in Jesus Christ because he is the priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. Now, sadly, in our world today, there are still too many leaders who live lives of corrupt luxury while people wallow in poverty and disease. In the church, too, there has been a history of leadership abusing its position, times when service was replaced with power, simplicity by material comfort, and vocation by privilege. There have been too many terrible examples of shepherds covering over wrongdoings of some who were entrusted with shepherding. These biblical stories, though, provide us several lessons for leaderships. Here are 5 challenges. Integrity. God calls leaders to maintain high ethical standards and integrity in their actions. The story of Eli's sons reminds us of the importance of honesty, transparency, and accountability. Responsibility. Leaders have a responsibility to serve and protect those under their care. Eli's failure to discipline his sons and hold them accountable for their wrongdoing contributed to their downfall. Leaders must be vigilant in addressing misconduct and ensuring that their actions align with the best interests of the community. Humility. Effective leadership requires humility and a willingness to listen to feedback and guidance. Eli's reluctance to confront his son's misconduct ultimately led to his downfall. Leaders should be open to constructive criticism, willing to acknowledge their mistakes. And consequences. The story of Eli's sons illustrate the consequences of poor leadership, both for the leaders themselves and for those that they led. Leaders should be mindful of the impact of their decisions and actions on others, recognizing that their choices can have far-reaching consequences. Overall, the story of Eli's sons serve as a reminder of the importance of ethical leadership, accountability, and humility in guiding and serving others. However, I want to point out that these lessons are not just for leaders, but for all Christians who regard themselves as practicing. That's you and me. Shepherding is the responsibility of all who are entrusted with the care of others. Parents, teachers, medical personnel, social workers, most of us, in one way or another. Many of us might think, oh, we're not in positions of leadership, so this isn't relevant to me. But we mustn't think in the terms of worldly, cultural terms, like positions. Is not a grandparent in a leadership role to a grandchild? Is not a parent a leader in the family? Is not one of us following God's call to instigate a new church event a leader? As adults, we are all at some point in our lives in charge of something, in a place where we can encourage and bless others. So let us all reflect on our own relationships and leadership. We're all called to be examples of Christ, living with reverence, humility, and integrity. Of course, religious and public leaders have a greater responsibility because their position has more influence, and when they get it wrong, it has wider consequences. But don't think that means God is not asking for the same life of reverence and integrity for those who do not hold a cultural position. If we follow Jesus, then the way we live our lives in word and action are an example to our family and community. Living by example is leadership. We are all called to lead people to Christ through living out God's love. Our faith tells us that every individual is created in the image of God, and he imbues us all with inherent value and purpose. For Christians, this understanding empowers us then to take on leadership roles within our communities, serving as examples of compassion, integrity, and service to others. The Word of God emphasizes to us the importance of using our talents and resources to positively impact the world, motivating us to actively engage in community initiatives and leadership positions to foster positive change. Ultimately, our Christian faith calls us to lead by example, embodying principles of integrity, love, justice, and humility in all our relationships, simply living out God's love. We will all be judged on our leadership, but if we seek God's perspective, we don't have to feel anxious about being a leader because we're also a follower. Jesus is our leader and we follow him. This takes us back to the theme at the beginning of the book of Samuel, when we looked at God being in control. We're to turn to Jesus and let his guidance and wisdom be our goal. Thanks to Jesus and the cross, God's kingdom has come in our hearts, and it is in a relationship with Jesus that we find the peace of fulfillment and contentment that we need to find peace in this world, along with the knowledge and hope that Jesus will return to restore and lead his kingdom here on earth. So these passages are to confront us with our own good and bad leadership and help us discern it in others. So to make it simple, this is what we might notice in ourselves. If we could have the slide up on the screen, Roz, that would be great. We've got a list here of good and bad shepherds. It's easy to look at others, though, and point judgment. But what are we doing in our large or small world of leadership, in the home, at work, or in our community groups? We've got examples here of bad shepherds taking care of themselves, worrying about their own comfort, speaking harshly or brutally, acting in ways that abandon and scatter community, and keeping the best for themselves. But Christ calls us to be good shepherds, to take care of our communities, strengthen the weak and the sick, search for the lost, rule and speak lovingly and gently, gather and protect community, and give our best to God and others. So I'm going to leave us now with some questions. What if we could have them up on the screen? And I'm going to ask us to spend a few minutes thinking about what's spoken to you today. There's been a lot of questions, a lot of different ways of looking at these passages. So do we focus on ourselves or those around us? Do we speak harshly or gently? Are there times when we make a sham or mockery of others' attempt at holiness? Do we give due reverence to spiritual matters? Where can you see leadership roles in your life and work? And are we being examples of good shepherds?